Well, hello, boys and girls, and welcome to our last session together. And I think it's fitting that our subject today should be corporate governance. Why? Well, because it's on my mind, and it should be on your mind too as you read your daily edition of the Wall Street Journal. Well, it's gorgeous in Vermilion today for a change. We've got intensive sun. Students again are out there getting a suntan on their blankets. Hey, it's a great day to be a student and a professor, right? Well, look, I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today about a topic that is definitely on everybody's mind, because corporate governance seems to be a subject that is not going away in terms of public interest and government regulation. Your chapter in the text discussed the Hewlett-Packard Board of Directors, who fired their CEO at the time, Mark Hurd, and certainly gave us a demonstration of an active board of directors getting involved and taking, obviously, the most drastic action it could regarding its CEO and the problems that arose under the CEO's leadership. So while on the one hand, Mark Hurd, HP's CEO, did a fairly good job of running the company and, most importantly, from the shareholders' point of view, raising HP's stock price, the problem was he had some ethical issues that he just couldn't seem to resolve. For example, a questionable relationship with a woman that he'd hired to help him at marketing events. This woman eventually accused him of sexual harassment, but he denied it. So what did the board of directors do? Procedurally the right thing. They investigated the matter. And guess what? The investigation disclosed that CEO Hurd made deceptive expense account claims and gave deceptive, let's just say unethical or dishonest answers to board members. So the question naturally arises in business, well, how fatal should these ethical deceptions be? Well, on the one hand, wow, he's making money for HP and its shareholders, so should we overlook his ethical deceptions? Well, the board of directors, I think, exercising its proper authority, said, wait a minute, the ship estate's the only ship that leaks from the top. And if the CEO is unethical and he's a role model, we would all agree that the CEO was a role model, right? Having the company, the whole company, behave this way is just unacceptable. And so, even though the board of directors caught a lot of criticism because Hurd was so good at, running the company and improving its stock price, nevertheless, the board of directors saw something in him that alarmed them, and that was his ethical standards, or shall we say, lack thereof. And so, as we're going to see when we get to the end of the chapter, of course, this leads us to, look at the board and its operations to try and learn some corporate governance principles. So we're back to our French friend Voltaire. Again, before you address me, define your terms. Well, what are the terms we should be concerned with? Well, corporate governance is the exercise of authority over members of a corporate community based on formal structures, rules, and processes. So you know who the stakeholders are in a company, right? And of course, shareholders elect directors to be the official parties responsible for the conduct of the company. And it is the board of directors, as we're going to see, that hires the officers, the CEO, the CFO, and other key executives in the company. So certainly all boards of directors have rules that reflect not only the powers of shareholders, but boards of directors themselves, and of course, managers. Excuse me. Some of this information is contained in the articles of incorporation that every publicly and even privately incorporated companies have to file with the state Secretary of State. But all corporations, all companies have bylaws too that set out, how the company. I mean, bylaws are fundamentally housekeeping rules. How often is the board of directors going to meet? Are you authorized to have board of directors meetings by telephone and Skype and so forth and so on? So understanding the legal creation of a corporation after an application has been filed with the state Secretary of State, because all corporations are fundamentally state, not federal entities. The state Secretary of State issues a corporate charter, which is actually a formal document that has a seal on it, that has the state seal on it, authorizing the corporation to do business in its name in accordance with its articles of incorporation. So this corporate charter, if you will, the articles of incorporation, set out the rights and responsibilities of stockholders, directors, officers, but usually it's the bylaws that set up the annual meetings, the size of the boards, the procedures for choosing and removing directors, and so forth. So that's pretty much where you find those. And, you may be able to find those online, because most companies, of course, are transparent with respect to their bylaws and how they operate. Now, clearly the owners of a publicly held company are the shareholders, right? The stockholders. We used to have actually big, beautiful, gorgeous stock certificates, and in the side of the certificate would state how many shares the certificate represented. But we don't do that. We don't have those anymore. But I understand that if you want to give them away and as Christmas presents to children and whatnot, to give them 10 shares in McDonald's, you can actually order them up. And I think they make great Christmas presents for children, because it starts children creating an interest in business and in taking a look at the stock market. And I remember when I got my shares in McDonald's, I was eager to look at the stock market page each day to see how my 10 shares of McDonald's stock were doing. But today, of course, electronic shares are the way ownership is transferred. So certainly your bylaws are going to set out, the authority to sell stock. What's the capital authorized? How many shares? And this normally will also be in your articles of incorporation, how many shares your company is authorized to be capitalized at. And it's quite common for boards of directors to increase that number of shares annually, and that requires amendment of the state articles of incorporation, which is an easy thing to do. Certainly, this is what the authority is, that shareholders certainly can sell their stock, right? They can, with each share of stock, common stock, the shareholder has a vote, a share, that they can use to elect directors. Certainly, the annual report, and I've got a couple of them right here that I wanted to show you. For example, this is General Electric's report, and this one is Daktronics, which is a signboard company here in South Dakota, up in Brookings. And so these things come out once a year. So General Electric's, for example, is like 146 pages long, where Daktronics is only about 51 pages or so long. So different sizes of the company have different sizes of reports. But what do the reports contain? Obviously, what the company has been up to since its last report, and also a financial audit by the auditing company that gives the shareholders an annual report as to the financial health of the company on an annual basis. Certainly, shareholders have the right to receive dividends. Dividends are declared by the board of directors. Certainly, the corporation, the shareholders can sue on behalf of the corporation if they believe directors or officers have committed wrongful acts. Now, let me point out to you that members of the board of directors are protected by what's called the business judgment rule. The business judgment rule is a rule of law in which, if you will, protects officers and directors of a company from liability, providing their mistakes do not meet a gross negligence level. Let me give you an example. Walt Disney's, the Disney company, had a CEO. He's retired now, by the name of Michael Eisner. Eisner hired a fellow by the name of Michael Ovitz to be the president of Disney. And CEO Eisner negotiated an employment contract with Ovitz that provided for a very lucrative separation clause, so that in the event that Ovitz voluntarily left or was let go by Disney, he would be paid a severance pay that involved over $140 million worth of Disney stock. Well, as fate would have it, after a year of working together, Eisner didn't get along with Ovitz and vice versa. So they mutually agreed Ovitz should leave his president position. But in so doing, Ovitz wanted to take his $140 million of Disney stock with him after only a year of employment. Well, as you might imagine, the shareholders, Mickey and Minnie Mouse, were very upset over what they considered to be outrageous conduct or misconduct by Eisner and also the board of directors, who in some sort of fashion approved this crazy contract. And so they sued in their state of incorporation, which was Delaware. And the Delaware Chancery Court held that while quite clearly this might involve negligence, that is the failure to use due care under the circumstances by Eisner and the board of directors, it didn't rise to what was considered to be gross negligence, that is reckless and wanton conduct. And that if you wish to hold members of the board of directors or officers personally liable for mistakes, the mistakes must rise to the level of gross negligence, and that they would not be liable for acts of simple negligence. And so Mickey and Minnie lost $140 million. So certainly shareholders are the owners of a company, and they have the authority at annual meetings to vote resolutions. And traditionally the board of directors has a proposal for votes. And if you certainly get enough votes, the shareholders have the ability to replace, or if you will, fire members of the board of directors who are up for election. But it's really important to understand who owns most of the publicly traded shares in the United States. Is it you and me, Joe Q. Citizen, or is it the pension funds, the insurance company funds? Is it those types of entities? And in fact, it is. So over half of all public corporation equity publicly traded corporation equity belongs to institutions. So let me give you another example. Tyco Corporation had a CEO by the name of Dennis Kozlowski, and he put his board of directors to sleep by giving them interest-free $1 million loans. And so they didn't look very carefully at what Dennis Kozlowski was doing. And he was embezzling and using property of the corporation as his own. Well, he was ultimately discovered and prosecuted and got 25 years imprisonment. But of course, you can imagine all the shareholders, the institutional shareholders at Tyco, were upset over this board of director misconduct to properly supervise the CEO. So the institutions got together and they fired the entire board of directors and replaced, cleaned house. So certainly, as we've mentioned before, that great phrase of Abraham Lincoln that the government should only do for the people what the people cannot do for themselves. Clearly, there is a need for regulation of corporate governance, right? And so we have seen from actually the stock market crash of 1929 began the cry for government regulation of the securities industry. And so we saw with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the defeat of President Herbert Hoover, we saw Congress enact the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Act of 1934, setting up the SEC as a regulating institution that had the authority to promulgate rules, which they have. So certainly we have seen all the way up to 2000 that maybe we just still don't have enough regulation to regulate enormous bankruptcies like Enron and WorldCom. WorldCom was the largest bankruptcy in history. And certainly WorldCom together with Enron represented enormous financial fraud, right? Not to mention the bankruptcies for all the shareholders. And so, as I've mentioned before, to every act of misconduct, there's going to be a reaction. And so not only Sarbanes-Oxley of 2002 was enacted, but as we saw in 2008, Dodd-Frank came into being. Well, so what did Sarbanes-Oxley do for us that you should be aware of? Well, it set up for the first time under the supervision of the SEC, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board to regulate accounting firms. And so it set up rules to improve auditing, which we would agree we needed improved auditing rules, and required all publicly traded companies to have a board of directors audit committee. That is an audit committee made up of members of the board of directors who had to be independent directors. What's an independent director? One who is not employed by the company as an employee, where a independent, where other types of directors may be employees, but an independent one is not an employee of the company. It certainly set up requirements now for CEOs and CFOs to personally certify, that is, they have to sign, attesting to the accuracy of financial statements submitted to the SEC. So clearly any fraudulent statement submitted is going to boomerang back on the CEOs and CFOs. And so I call this the Sarbanes-Oxley, the Full Employment Act for accountants, because no CEO or CFO is going to want to sign any financial document going to the SEC that is not absolutely accurate, because they're not willing to go to jail for their companies. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act also requires forfeiture of profits from stock sales and bonuses when a company has to restate its earnings because of fraud. And you recall when the Senate Financial Services Committee was interviewing John Stumpf, the CEO at Wells Fargo at the time, about the credit card and fraudulent opening of credit accounts. Clearly, he was attempting to protect not only his bonuses, but those of the members of the board of directors and other officers by saying, look, this only involved 1.9% of Wells Fargo's earnings or assets actually, and so therefore didn't really require a restatement of its revenue. There obviously is some debate about that, and of course Mr. Stump promptly got fired once he returned from his trip to Washington, D.C. to Wells headquarters in San Francisco. As I mentioned earlier about the Tyco $1 million interest-free loan situation to members of the board of directors, Sarbanes-Oxley specifically prohibits that type of largesse. And also bars offenders from ever serving as corporate directors or officers again, as Martha Stewart can testify to, right? So, after, of course, we had the fun and games of 2008 that, saw a number of companies like Lehman Brothers and Merrill Lynch and whatnot fail, this brought about another reaction, right? Dodd-Frank. And what did Dodd-Frank now require in a regulatory form? Well, shareholders now for the first time have the right to approve executive compensation and any special executive compensation involved in mergers or buyouts, because you can see the temptation there. There might be a conflict of interest, right? So let's have the shareholders vote on it. It's specifically laid out that members of the Executive Compensation Committee have to be independent, that is, not employees of the company. And companies are required, which are normally reported in the annual reports that I just showed you, right? Show you again. The companies are required to disclose how executive compensation is arrived at. Usually it is, of course, to be based on the financial performance of the company. And if a company restates its earnings because of a little fraudulent activity, then, of course, any executive compensation can be clawed back, which I think is what is happening to Mr. Stumpf and also, I believe, a vice president they had in charge of sales. So, in theory, as you might imagine, boards are supposed to be vigilant watchdogs over management, but that's not exactly the way it really works out. We've discussed previously that when members of the board of directors are up for election, how many candidates are nominated for each open director position? 1, right? So if you have 3 open positions, how many nominees are there? Normally only 3. That's the norm. So directors are often handpicked by CEOs under those situations. And certainly boards of directors are dependent on what information the executives provide them. So that's what we call putting a board to sleep by paying them a lot to do very little. Board of director cultures are normally harmonious because if you have abrasive, confrontational directors, obviously that creates disharmony. Who likes to work with people who are constantly giving you a hard time and so forth? And so normally boards of directors are friendly with one another. But, your best directors are those that ask good questions, requiring equally good answers, because that's their job as the member of a board of directors. Now, it is true that some board directors see service on a board as merely honorific or ceremonial and don't work very hard. I would suggest that that's a problem. And so you see some people, especially after they retire from their regular job, to get on what's called the board of directors circuit and sit on a number of boards. Well, that can be a problem. because if you sit on too many boards, well, how much work are you really doing? And maybe their board of directors just want your name, not any earnest work on your part. And so some CEOs, as distinguished from the HP case that was at the beginning of your chapter today, many CEOs see their boards as unproductive and want to keep them that way. So this is what directors are supposed to do. Certainly increasing the number of shares, as I mentioned earlier, requires their approval. Reviewing, of course, companies' annual goals and strategies, certainly selecting the CEO and, perhaps the CFO, depends on the key officers, which ones the board is going to be responsible for recruiting and hiring. Creating governance policies, setting executive compensation I mentioned already, and then, of course, evaluating themselves. What system are they using? What metric is being applied for effective as opposed to ineffective member service? And then, as I already mentioned, nominating candidates for one slot each, right? The average board across corporate America is has about 11 members who may serve 1 to 3 years. Boards meet on an average of about 8 times a year. Sometimes they'll meet at the company headquarters. Sometimes they'll meet at airports so they can fly in and fly out the same day. Inside directors, as I mentioned earlier, are employees like the CEO, or maybe the CFO sits on the board too. And those that aren't employed, as I mentioned earlier, like the independent directors, are considered outside directors. Boards of directors are routinely divided up into committees. So, for example, I sit on the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce and Development Company here in Vermilion. And I also happen to chair the tourism committee. And so that's the committee that I sit on. And so very normal for members of the board of directors. Everybody sits on some type of committee, audit, compensation, nominating, whatever. Now, an interesting subject that you may not be familiar with is the combining of the chairman of the board of directors position with that of the CEO, the chief executive officer position of a company. So clearly the CEO is a full-time employee. You would think the chairman of the board of directors ought to be an independent director, somebody who's not an employee, right? Well, but the norm in the United States is for American corporations to combine the two positions together. Is that a problem? Well, it's interesting to note that Europe and outside the United States, the norm is for those two positions to be separate, so that the chairman of the board of directors, together with the other directors, have an obligation to supervise the actions of the CEO and the other officers. But if the positions are combined, is there a potential conflict of interest? And you can see why those positions that are combined, why the incumbent CEOs would be opposed to seeing them split up. But after the catastrophes that have happened at Wells Fargo and continue to happen, as your Wall Street Journal reveals, Wells Fargo split their CEO and chairman of the board positions. It's about time. Show me the money. So you're probably wondering, so how do these chief executives, these CEOs, how do they get paid? Well, there's certainly a compensation committee at the board of directors, because you would think they want to have pay following performance of the company. That if, net revenue is up, hey, well, we should attribute the success of the company in no small part to that of the CEO's leadership and policies. But pay may be unrelated to performance. Do you see a problem there? Yeah. And so historically, total CEO compensation is normally composed of these elements. A base salary based on, what the average is for the particular industry. Note that only up to $1 million is deductible by the company as a business expense. So base salaries seem to hover around $1 million. There are, of course, annual cash incentives known as bonuses that are earned as performance targets are met or exceeded. And then, of course, there are long-term stock incentives. So what do they look like? Well, stock options. Have you heard of stock options? Hopefully you have, because you should know what a stock option is. It gives an executive, now these aren't available just to the CEO. They are usually available to senior executives in a company, obviously creating a executive team. A stock option authorizes an executive to buy the company's stock at a fixed price or grant price in the future on a specified vesting date. So let's assume for the moment that the board of directors sets the compensation for a CEO, saying that you are authorized 100,000 stock options that will give you the right to buy the company at today's market price 2 years from now. So as an illustration, that obviously tries to align the CEO's personal interest in the stock options with the increase in the stock price and ostensibly the value and growth of the company. Obviously an encouragement incentive, right? The grant price is normally either the close of the market on the grant date. So today's, price normally would be the grant date. The vesting date, is always normally some years in the future. But, and I think Hewlett Packard is a good example. The stock price is worth less than the grant price. So let's take, for example, Hewlett Packard and Carly Fiorina. The stock price at Hewlett Packard was lower 6 years after she had taken over as the CEO. So whatever stock option she had with a grant price on the day they were issued to her probably were going to be worthless, because the stock price for the company was worth less in the future. So, there are possibilities of backdating options and things of that nature, but of course this has to be disclosed in the annual report to shareholders. Performance shares, I think you can see and understand that those are related. What is restricted stock? It is stock that once awarded cannot be sold until some specific date in the future, usually at least a year. Retirement plans, those are notoriously generous, known as golden parachutes, which are ways that companies try and retire their executives instead of firing them, like John Stumpf at Wells Fargo. Now, besides money, there are goodies like life insurance and golf club memberships, health club memberships, things of that nature that are, if you will, part of the benefits package of CEOs. Are there any problems that exist with CEO compensation? What do you think? Certainly there have been some outrageous, extraordinary payouts, right? Because think about it. What can a company do with profit? One, it can reinvest it, right? Two, it can be used to pay the board of directors and chief executives lugubrious amounts of money. Or three, it can be paid in shareholder dividends. What do you think of these three options for profit is the most common? So compensation is supposed to be aligned with performance, but doesn't always work out that way, right? And hence, if you're voting institutional shares of stock, you may want to vote against pension plans that aren't aligned properly. Certainly, and that's why I think the annual audit report is very important, because if you have manipulation of accounting measures, that is something that I think involves bilking the shareholders of their equity and their corporate value. And it's true, when you read these compensation packages in annual reports, they're not easy to read. So it is true that in the overall authority triangle of shareholders, boards of directors, and management, management usually is dominant when it's really supposed to be the board of directors, right? And every time we have some big smash up, as we had in the years 2000 and 2008, to every action, there's going to be a government reaction in the form of regulation. So certainly too big to fail is a good illustration of what we're talking about. So looking at our textbook case, we had a really interesting case, I think, involving Carly Fiorina. She obviously was a very strong-willed CEO. Eventually, she went on to run for governor of California. She didn't win, but she had a very strong will. But the question became, how much authority and control should she be exercising there versus the board of directors? Duties of directors are set forth in your text on page 652. I recommend you take a look at it, because generally speaking, all boards of directors have two fundamental duties. First, to represent the interests of shareholders, and therein lies some conflict of interest sometimes, right? And then secondly, to watch over management. So in our text recitation, they illustrated that HP's board of directors really seriously carried out these duties. And when we had the stock price going nowhere, or when we had serious ethical transgressions, as in the case of Mark Hurd, they took specific action. So the boards are responsible for certainly improving major strategies and goals. And it approved, CEO Fiorina's plans to restructure the operations and centralize management. And so, yes, they've got the authority to select, evaluate, and remove a CEO. And after 6 years, with HP's stock price not going anywhere, they hung on to Fiorina longer than, maybe they really should have. And then they selected, Mark Hurd, and we saw how things went with him. Well, on the board of directors, you had a couple of real activists, this Thomas Perkins and George Kiewith, who were really offering new strategies and exploring ideas for new products. This obviously collided with the management decisions of CEO Fiorina. And so there is that tension, and I would suggest that's a healthy tension between members of the board of directors and chief executive officers. That where is the dividing line between CEO prerogative and board of directors supervision? And I would suggest that's a gray area and depends on the company. Now, as I mentioned, the nominating committees nominate one person for each vacancy. And I think your board of directors is no better than the quality of the people you nominate for those positions. And again, you have to take a good look at the board of directors. And I think Wells Fargo is a good illustration of a case in point. So Wells Fargo is the third largest bank in the United States. That's big, right? That's big behind Bank of America and JP Morgan, I guess it is. And so you look at that and you wonder, well, Wells Fargo's this third biggest bank. Its board of directors knew since 2011 that they were having these employee scams going on. Yet the company didn't eradicate this particular scam situation, incentivizing employees with crushing goals that got them to discard their ethical standards because they needed to keep their jobs, and the rest you know. Wells Fargo's board of directors and John Stump, their CEO, defended, saying, well, look, it only affected 1.9% of Wells Fargo's assets, so it's really not serious in nature because it affected such a small part of their asset business. Well, the Senate Finance Services Committee didn't agree. And of course, ultimately, when John Stump returned to San Francisco, he got canned because he didn't handle the Wells Fargo case very well. Well, subsequent to that, as you've been reading, and also as one of your discussion opportunities, the Fed ordered Wells Fargo to remove 4 of the members of their board of directors, clearly trying to send them a message, hey, your board of directors are not doing their job. And if they're not going to do their job, well, we're going to demand that you fire them. Subsequent to that, well, besides the $187 million in fines and remuneration that it has to provide its customers, now they've gotten hit with $1 billion of fines and whatnot involving their mortgage business. And it's 2018. And so you wonder, holy Toledo, how can they continue to have these systemic ethical and legal problems? Well, your text, brings up all of the inside problems at Hewlett-Packard, to include a Wall Street Journal written by director Tom Perkins. So he's trying to explain their situation. And that, the board of directors' main goal is to boost company performance and benefit shareholders. Hey, everybody would agree with that, right? Their board is small and actively involved in strategy, tactics, picking managers, and reviewing their decisions. And the question, of course, that CEOs have asked at HP is, maybe you're getting a little too involved in the day-to-day operations and the strategy and so forth. But certainly HP had a number of directors who had significant technical expertise and maybe knew technically more than some of their CEOs did. So you've got 2 types of board of directors. He tried to explain a guidance board and a compliance board. And what's a compliance board? Well, I mean, versus a guidance board. A guidance board really is very actively involved in details, if you will, where a compliance board is focused on obeying government requirements and adhering to public requirements. And you can see the tension that arose between the board of directors, its members, of course, and CEO Fiorina and CFO Patricia Dunn. And so you had a power struggle. And the problem with a power struggle is that sooner or later somebody has got to lose. And so for Fiorina, while she wanted a compliance board, she didn't have one, and eventually she lost her position, i.e., she got fired. Was she fairly treated by the board? Well, depends on, which side you're on, I suppose, whether you're a compliance board or a guidance board advocate. But certainly her board was not a compliance board as much as it was a guidance board, and she just couldn't get in sync with it. And the board certainly couldn't get in sync with her. Now, what about leaks? Now, you can turn on the television, every night and listen to CNBC and CNN and Fox and whatnot about leaks, informed sources from the White House. Or how's that old saying go about dissemination of information in the government? Well, let's see. You can release it via television, you can release it via teleradio, or you can tell a congressman. And the most secret of secrets gets released. Well, leaks. Certainly leaks in government are one thing, and I strongly recommend and encourage you see the movie The Post, which is about the Washington Post during the Pentagon Papers era. It's a really tremendously interesting business movie about the Washington Post and the publisher Katharine Graham and the editor-in-chief Ben Bradley and the whole Pentagon Papers leaking situation. Well, leaks in government are one thing. Leaks in a business, I would suggest, are entirely different, because leaks in a business certainly involve a loyalty issue, an integrity issue, and an ethics issue. And when members of the board of directors engage in leaking because, they're trying to assert some type of control over the CEO, is that ethical as a means of trying to exercise director control? Because remember the F word, fiduciary. It is a legal duty that all employees, to include directors, owe their companies. And is it ethical? Is it trustworthy to be leaking information to the press in order to gain some type of advantage, political advantage, on the board of directors against a CEO? So, of course, there is the issue of whether or not the leaks were, legal to start with, because Patricia Dunn used pretexting. Pretexting is, if you will, false representations, lying, if you will, in order to get people to provide information to you. So, the way she went about it was considered by and large to be unethical. Should the leaker, Keyworth, be asked to resign? I think absolutely. He swore and signed non-disclosure agreements that he would not engage in this activity, and he did. So I think he's as unethical as some of the other CEOs involved in this situation, and should have been, and was, of course, encouraged to resign. So clearly the infighting and the battles here did not work to HP's benefit, and to have this go on for, on and off for 6 years, obviously is not good for business. What wasn't good for all of the parties involved, and there should have been removal of a number of parties much earlier. If a board and a CEO can't get along, somebody's got to go. And you don't need 6 years to figure that out. So what things could have been taken to try and fix HP's board? In all honesty, given the complexity of it and the personalities involved, I think you just, as in the Wells Fargo case, you need to clean house and start afresh with a new board, or, as it turned out, a new CEO. Because once you have members of the board that are leaking, or even on the executive side of the house, engaging in leaking activities, you're violating the fiduciary in a major way. It's not going to work for the company in the long, let alone the short run. So you can, ask some questions about, was Fiorina and were Fiorina and Dunn being, targeted or picked on or taken advantage of because they were women? I think the answer to that depends on who you, talk to. But does it matter to have 7 men and 2 women on the board? Yeah, I think like the Supreme Court, having 6 men and 3 women, I think makes a difference. And so certainly the lens of gender analysis is different between men and women. There's a good book that I strongly recommend to anybody who is going to get married called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And that gives you, if you will, a interesting perception look through different gender eyes. And especially before anybody gets married, I highly recommend it. I had a friend give me a copy before I got married, and I'm glad he did. Well, boys and girls, we have come to the end of our journey together. I promised you it would be scintillating, didactic, and provocative. Hopefully you have found it that way. And if there's anything I can do for you, I'm just an email away, boys and girls. Stay well, and for those of you who are graduating, congratulations. Do well out there in the business world. We need good, trustworthy executives. Stay well. Bye-bye. To be continued.